let me tell you how this developed and where this is going to. And this developed because a lot of people were interested in, and Charles is very involved in the APG discovery thinking forums and having people that have experience making those discoveries and making those presentations. And I was asked to do the Wolfbone presentation in the Delaware Basin. I thought that would be a presentation or two, and that ended up being more and more organizations with APG and local societies, and then some of the engineers by mistake ended up in those meetings, so SPE invited me to do it. And after doing that several dozen times, and I always enjoy it doing that, it came to me, what Charles is doing for APG and what you do when you give those field discovery papers, it's fantastic because you learn from other people's experiences and you see how they put it together, how they overcame some of the difficulties. But what I realized it wasn't answering is these young people that are listening to that, the next time they come up and have those kind of opportunities, it's going to look totally different than whatever you talked about that particular day. So I wanted to get a more universal thought. What is, when we talk about discovery thinking, what is that process? Why is it that some people are extremely creative, and I agree with some of the numbers that we saw earlier today, that when I first started becoming a manager, I kind of wondered, well, why is this person making twice what this person? And so 25, 30 years ago, I thought everybody was a little more uniform. Well, after managing people for a couple of years, I finally realized those numbers are accurate. The same guy that came up with the numbers that were company makers last year is the same guy that's doing it this year. And it happens time after time after time. So it's the top 10 or 20% of people that have those kind of abilities. Well, once we started looking at creative thinking and realized everybody's creative. Everybody's capable of critical thinking. It is at different levels and how you're able to succeed in doing that. And then the other thing is we all can learn to become better critical thinkers and more creative thinkers. And so that's what this program is all about. This is going to be an introduction to it today. Charles and I, in about a month, October 23rd, I think, for the GCAGS, and I'm sorry, convention. GeoGolf.
Yes, sir.
Is, we'll be presenting this as a half-day seminar, and so we're hoping to have a lot of young people in the room to be able to share some of these ideas and concepts, because these are important to learn early on. But for this audience, I took the other approach. This is a more mature audience, obviously. Well, why is it that it's people, especially in oil and gas, and especially among geologists, that it's not the 20-somethings that are doing it? It's not really even the early 30-somethings that are doing it. Now, in high-tech kind of IT industry, it is. And so we're going to take a look at that and why that is, and why it takes longer in the oil and gas industry, especially for geologists, to get to that level. I wanted to start with some of the things that Bob was looking at earlier, and some of the things where we're going now and what's happening in the industry, and I'll conclude with some of those thoughts also. Is when I worked for Herbert Hunt, I realized, and Herbert told me this one time, he goes, Bill, every 15 years there's some major technology change that's either disruptive or very successful in the oil and gas industry. And so right now everybody thinks that's machine learning and IT. And the point I want to make about that is, as Bob was emphasizing, those are tools. And so the original concept hasn't changed. Oil and gas is not found by those tools. It's found by what's in the minds of men. So we have to recognize machine learning and IT for what it is. It's a tool. And it's the same thing that happened with 3D seismic. Remember when it all happened, we realized that discoveries, and Bob, I have some more figures for you that maybe you can incorporate in your thoughts in there too. And this is because I stayed onshore in the United States my career, so that I knew that someday I would be an independent oil and gas guy, and that's where I wanted to go. Well, when 3D hit South Louisiana, the success rate in South Louisiana went from 29% to 42%. Well, it's not a 13% change, that's a 50% change in exploration success. And so that was what was happening in the late 80s and early 90s. So we know now, okay, maybe it is IT and machine learning, but it is only going to be applied properly if it's given to geologists who have those creative minds that can do something with that data information. Companies that think, and I think this is where a lot of companies are going, is that I can replace all of my geoscientists with artificial intelligence are really going to find out in a couple years, boy, did they make a huge financial mistake when they have no new investment opportunities for their companies. So it's just a tool. So we're 15 years into the resource revolution, so maybe IT and machine learning is one of the new tools that is really changing the industry. 15 years before that, it was unconventionals. Again, nothing really new. It was just kind of the combination of drilling horizontal wells, and we've certainly gotten better with the completions. 15 years before that, it was 3D seismic. 15 years before that, it was the introduction of computers on our desk for the first time, and having the computer power to take 2D seismic and make it multifold seismic data. 15 years before that, it was nuclear logs. So all of those were revolutions that changed the industry, but each one of those is only a tool. So that's what I'd like to emphasize, not for this group, I know I don't need to do that, but really for the big oil and gas companies. I want to hit here just a couple things. Riverford Exploration is my company that I started 15 years ago. We'll take a look at that because we're going to talk about long-range thinking and long-range strategy, so it's going to tie in very closely with what we've just heard. The other, and kind of a change for me, is I'm still at the Bureau of Economic Geology. I moved back to the Woodlands from Austin just within the last couple of weeks. I'll be based in the Houston area, so I'll be close to the industrial partners who are funding the research that's going on at the University of Texas in a new role. So hopefully I'll see a lot more of you a lot more often here in Houston. So let's start with the Houston event. And this was and I love Super Bowls, and I love them for all different reasons in different years. And I love talking to this group because you're all kind of like me. I've seen all 53 Super Bowls. And not only that, I remember before the Super Bowls, they were the championships. I remember some of those great championship games in Green Bay in the early 1960s, which were fantastic. Well, this was obviously, I love the Super Bowls and all for various reasons. As a young football player, it was always about the football game, but my dad and my grandpa would be there, the family would all be there. So I've learned now it's not just all about the football, it's about being with our family, it's about seeing the commercials sometimes are better than the football games are. But this was one that was certainly something that was really exciting. And it was Atlanta and New England. I'm not really a fan of either one of those teams, but I really respect what New England is able to do, and I respect them because of the leadership and the performance of the athletes working together to be able to perform the way they did. This was the first touchdown in the game. I think if I was the running back for Atlanta and I was in the Super Bowl, he obviously didn't need to jump up and down and roll in the end zone, but if you score a touchdown during the Super Bowl, you're allowed to do that. Well, what happened in that game? It was all Atlanta in the first half. And Atlanta was up, 28. Well, they were up 21-0. And there were 3 seconds left in the first half. And New England kicked a field goal. At halftime, it was 21-3, I believe. And so they went in at halftime with that kind of score. As they came out again, it was still all Atlanta. And it was all Atlanta through the first half of the third quarter. And then they scored again. It was 28-3. We're 62% of the way through the game. And please remember that number. 62.5% of the way through the game. And New England is down 28-3. Well, they came into that game with a strategy, I'm sure. And they came in, and the players knew the strategy, and the coaches knew the strategy, and the management knew what that strategy was. They're 2/3 of the way through the game. They've got to be creative enough to change their strategy, do that instantaneously. They don't have time for corporate meetings. They don't have time to do that. Probably one guy is making that decision, that's Belichick, obviously, of how we change that strategy and make those things work. So we'll take a look at what happened. Obviously what happened is they were able to tie the game in the last 57 seconds of regulation. And it was the first Super Bowl, I believe, that went to overtime. And then New England got the ball, and they drove down and scored, and the game was over in overtime period. All right. So I'm going to start looking at creative and critical thinking, and I'm going to use the scientific method. And I'm going to create a hypothesis. And the hypothesis I want to make here is that in the oil and gas industry, and especially if we're looking at developing a new corporation, this is a young person's game. And it's important to do and develop these early in life in one's career, regardless of the technical discipline. And that's the technical hypothesis that we're going to try and prove. And I'll cut to the conclusion, I'm not going to be able to prove it. All right. So if we're going to take a scientific method, I think everybody's seen deGrasse Tyson and making presentations. And the good thing he said about science and the scientific method is, the good thing about it is science is that it's true whether or not you believe it. Well, does anybody know why he would have made that kind of statement and what particular science he was talking about when he made that statement to make his point?
Sounds like climate change.
Yeah, he's a big proponent of climate change, and I'm not here to argue, plus or minus on that. But he was saying, because the scientific method had been so thoroughly used on climate science, that regardless of whether your opinion is that it exists or not, science has proven that it exists or not. Well, so let's think about the scientific method that's been used in the climate science arguments. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to look at critical thinking, and we're going to look at creative thinking and strategic thinking, and then we're going to objectively analyze whether our hypothesis is true or not. Well, one thought is that entrepreneurship and developing companies is a young person's game, because people like Mark Zuckerberg was 20 years old, halfway through Harvard when he developed and launched Facebook. Steve Jobs was 22, and actually he was younger than that when he started it. He was 22 when Apple II was released. And Google was started by two guys when they were 23 years old. So there's certainly a bias, and the opinion is out there that this is a young person's game of being able to do that. Well, this is the outline of what we'll do today. We'll look at creative and critical and strategic thinking for the natural sciences, and especially for geologists, and we'll go through this various outline. So the first thing that we're going to look at are critical thinking skills. And to understand critical thinking, we all think that we're good critical thinkers, but we're all at different development stages in critical thinking. And Bloom's taxonomy was developed in the 1950s, I believe, and he calls these learning domains. Well, they're not only learning domains, they're thinking domains. And the basis of those pyramids are remembering and understanding, the first two principles of the learning domains. And what we know from these are that you can remember and understand, and you can be very successful throughout your education. At most universities, all the way through the university, as long as you remember and understand the basics of what you've been told, and you can repeat that back to your professors, you can come up with some pretty good grades. And so we really don't get into any critical thinking phases yet, but that you have to have a basis of remembering and understanding. The other part I'll throw in on this is, the more you develop and the more that you learn, the more that you have to remember and understand, the better you're going to do throughout your career. So if you stop at 22 years old, as far as your education, you don't have as much to remember and understand. So keep that process going throughout. And then the other thing that we're going to look at is how many different disciplines that you have to understand and remember things at. Well, what are the levels above that? And I've got that black line there. And these are the next levels in Bloom's taxonomy of learning domains, is applying, analyzing, and then evaluating. Well, as we apply what we've learned, as we analyze that information, and then we make evaluations, that's more critical thinking than the early steps are in that process. And those make up, by the time we get to evaluation, those make up the critical thinking skills. Well, what if you're evaluating something and you don't have the first two steps? You don't have anything to remember, you don't have anything to understand. What's that called? That's opinion, which is the lowest form of critical thinking, right? That's opinion. So what we want to do as scientists is When we get to the applying, analyze, and evaluation stages, we want to do that on a very solid basis of remembering and understanding. So the better you've done in those lower steps, the better you're going to do in these upper steps. Now, these aren't age dependent. There are people in elementary school that can evaluate what they've learned and lessons they've learned. They're not very good at it yet, but they can. But most people at that age are not doing that level of thing. So it's a little bit of age dependent, but it's not necessarily all age dependent. Well, there was an interesting article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal as colleges were getting ready for the school year in 2017, 2018. And what they've done for decades is they've tested students in critical thinking skills. And what they do with these tests is they test freshmen coming in during orientation, and they test them again during their last semester of their senior year. And what they found out is that the large, well-respected universities in the United States are doing a very poor job developing critical thinking skills. Now, the large universities, as you see from the writing in the bottom of that, they defend that by saying, well, the students we bring in the top 10% of the students. They already have all the evaluation and analysis skills that they need when they come into school. Well, most people would disagree with that. At 18 years old, your ability to make a thorough evaluation and a thorough analysis is very, very undeveloped. And hopefully you're developing that through college. Well, why is it difficult for large universities to develop the critical thinking skills? Because they do have the brightest minds. So that means they have the brightest minds of people that were able to remember and understand what they were taught throughout the high school level or proprietary school, wherever they went. So they got good grades and being able to repeat that back, so they were A students. Well, now you take the 10% of all the students in the country and you put them in classrooms of 300 people as they go through that university that has 50,000 students. How much interaction do they have with the professor? How often are they critically challenged by the professor to think through a question to answer that professor individually? So where are the critical thinking skills being developed most accurately? At all those small liberal arts schools, the kids that didn't get into MIT and didn't get into Harvard and didn't get into Yale are developing better critical thinking than the top 10% of the students who did. So that is just kind of an interesting process. But it also points out that critical thinking skills can be developed and don't have to be something that's just naturally applied. And all these things that we're looking at, critical thinking, strategic thinking, and creativity, we'll see there are people that are just naturally talented in doing all these things. And what a blessing, and those are the people that we typically think of as being these top 10% of the people. But we also can take people that are in that next 50% and train them and get them into that top 10 to 20%. So when we look at critical thinking, this was our hypothesis, and I've underlined critical thinking. And so critical thinking is a young person's game developed early in life. And what we've seen by this information is that that's not true. Critical thinking is something that gets developed as we go through life, and you can enhance that as you go through your career. And again, I think this is important in the mentorship that we talked about. And we talk about it not only being challenged directly by your professor. It's not about taking a test. It's not about writing a paper. It's about once you've written that paper, does somebody come back and challenge you on the thought or ask you to develop the reasoning behind your thought and being able to do that. That's how we develop these skills. And so as good mentors, that we can help younger people understand that once they write a report for us or they show us a prospect, we can challenge them and ask them to think through those skills, and they'll start to develop some of those things. But we don't develop that until we get to an older age. So then let's look at creative thinking and the complexity of natural sciences. And some of you have seen this information before, so we'll go through this a little bit more quickly. But this is what Steve Jobs had to say about creativity, because creativity, and I'll let you read that as I talk for a minute here, because you ask people what is creative or who is creative. That's actually an easier question to ask, who is creative, And everybody would probably, if they've worked with the same group of people, come up with the same 2 or 3 people that are creative people. So we know what it is, and we know who it is that's creative, but coming up with a good definition of it is a little bit more difficult. And I put this up here because I think this is an okay definition, but we're going to look a little bit more detail in doing this, because people that are creative, I think it's, he says that they don't really know how they did it. They just put together things that other people didn't see, and actually they'll feel a little guilty about doing that. I've never felt guilty about being creative, so I don't necessarily agree with that. But one of the important things that we'll see is, especially for geologists, is this integration and this synthesis. And so when we look at the domains again, and we think about those thinking domains, that you have to get up to a high enough level where you can start to synthesize. What we're going to see in a minute is, in non-complex sciences, and we have to be very careful to define that when we say it, because people are going to get offended when I start to say some of these things. Chemistry and physics and math are not complex in the way I'm going to define it. And non-complex means if you're in a science or a math that has a lot of laws, it's this or it's this. That's non-complex. So somebody put up the quote from John Wayne earlier, it's either black or white, or I don't understand why it's not. That's true with the non-complex sciences. It's black or white, there's laws, we understand what it is. So to be creative in that science and take that science forward, it's not necessarily important to have a lot more of experience and understanding. All you're doing is linear thought and taking it to the next level. So people at a very young age, and I'm getting ahead of myself for my slides, but people at a very young age can contribute to a science like that. In geosciences and more complex sciences, and this is the synthesis that we see in geosciences, is in geosciences, you're not going to be a successful, especially a petroleum geologist, you're not going to be a successful petroleum geologist because you're the best sedimentologist only, or the best structural geologist only, or the best geochemist only. You have to have a very good understanding of all of those. So we think about the domains again. You have to have an understanding and remembering of all those different disciplines. And then you're going to have to synthesize and combine all of them together to get a creative idea in petroleum geology. That makes it a much more complex science than these non-complex sciences that we're talking about. But some of those points of the synthesis are very important to doing it. So let's talk about creativity. When I was in grade school, one of the definitions of the difference between man and animals was that man used tools and animals didn't. Well, as I mentioned, we're all creative. Everybody was able to make it down here on a today when we had all this rain out here that was not forecast last night. I listened to the 10 o'clock news very carefully. I did my analysis. I knew what time I had to leave home to get here on time. And then we were hit by all the variables that we all had to deal with. So we were all creative in just getting down here today versus the people who weren't able to make it. Well, we know that definition that I learned in grade school is not correct. We learned that other primates are using tools of different types, and we now found out crows are exceptionally smart birds for some reason, and there are other animals that use tools in their work. So obviously, and then once a crow sees a crow doing this, they start mimicking that behavior. But that there was a crow that was the first one that did this that everybody else saw before they started doing it. And so even at that level, a crow can be a very creative animal to get to his food. Well, when we talk about creative thinking is the last very kind of that pinnacle on Bloomberg's taxonomy. And we drew a black line between understanding and applying because that is a leap. We go from remembering to understanding, and then we go to applying. There's a little bit of a leap between understanding and being able to apply it. And so that's why, again, if you're at a smaller school and have to face a professor on a daily basis, and he asks you not only to repeat what you maybe learned the night before, but he asks you to apply it, that takes a step up, and you're getting into these critical thinking domains, so there's a step there. So above evaluation There's also a black bar, but there's a gap because there's a little bit of a jump because you can go, a lot of people will get up to the point where they can evaluate prospects really well, but there's a gap between someone who can evaluate something really well and who's the creative person that's able to come up with these thoughts in petroleum geology to come up with a new prospect. So this is basically the terminology there. So now we're going to look at these complexity of sciences as we define. And this McAllister and Hay, 1975, that was my first evening's assignment in my first Principles of Geology class. And it stuck with me so well. And so this is copied directly from the introduction of that textbook on physical geology. And so what they're showing there is on the y-axis, we're looking at the success in developing laws. So this is how we're defining complexity. As we talked about physics and chemistry and the other math, it's a lot of laws. And then, so the things on the x-axis, as we develop greater and greater complexity, there are fewer and fewer laws. Most of the laws I know about geology, I either learned in physical or historical geology. The rest of my undergraduate education and all my graduate school education was learning about all the exceptions. Maybe I learned about Walther's law a little bit later on, but that, there aren't a lot of laws in what we do in petroleum geology versus what we have in physics and chemistry, and probably even fewer than there are in biology. So I've taken this and I've expanded it a little bit, and I've added a little bit more. I've divided the natural sciences from the social sciences, and I have, so I have 2 degrees in natural sciences. I also have 2 degrees in social sciences. And when you get into social sciences, we even think, well, is it even a science as much as compared to natural science? Well, it is. The other extreme that's not even on here is my wife is a counselor and a psychologist. Well, that's actually a science, but it's probably off this chart, right? Way to the right. But they're still sciences, and we still can do those. And I've put in most of the things. I put in a lot of what we use in petroleum geology, and then I put in also a lot of the other disciplines that we deal with in petroleum geology, for example, land. But what you can see there is we start off with the math, the chemistry, and the physics on the far left. And what's not very far from the far left is engineering. And it's much further to the left than almost all the geosciences. And look where medicine is. That kind of interested me. Medicine is even more to the left than basic biology, and even a lot of what we do in geology. And so paleontology is kind of a little bit further over. And why is that? It's because it's not only dealing with natural sciences at a given time, it's dealing with the natural sciences over a longer period of time. So you'll see a lot of the things that move further to the left, further to the right, also deal more with time. Even on our petroleum geosciences, sedimentology and stratigraphy are not as time dependent as understanding the basin analysis and whole petroleum system. And the whole petroleum system has a lot of time variables in it. It makes it a much more complex science. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Nobel laureates and the various areas that are circled, and I'm going to add some more to that. And we're going to look at the age differences between some of those that are the non-complex sciences and those are the complex sciences, and see what those differences are. Well, we're going to start with physics, and these are the Nobel laureates by age, and we'll do a little bit of correction here at the end. The mode, the reason I use the histograms are, the modes are a little bit easier to pick out. These are 5-year segments. That's why it's 2.5 and 7.5. Something that's 7.5 obviously is between 5 and the next decade going up. So you can see the Nobel laureates by age in physics, and the median is between 45 and 50 years old. That's actually a pretty young age. What we'll look at the very end here is usually when you get a Nobel Prize, probably when you came up with that creative idea was probably 10 or 15 years before that. So if you were 50 years old when you won it, you were 35 years old when you came up with a creative idea. That's the median. So look, there are people that down at 27 years old that are winning Nobel Prizes. Well, there's a little bit of an error there. When you are awarded a Nobel Prize, you're able to share that with up to 2 people. So one person will actually be the lead on a project, the principal investigator. And the principal investigator can say, this one person or these 2 people were critical, and so they get, so when Madame Curie won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, she co-nominated her daughter. So she was in her 50s or 60s, but her daughter was probably not yet 30. So just keep that in mind when you see some of these very young ages. But this is the overall distributions, and you can see that's a very young distribution. And so let's increase it a little bit and look at chemistry. You can see a little bit of a jump here. You can see that the median is gone up to 52.5. So these people are over 50 years old by the time they get their Nobel laureates. And then it's trailing off to the right-hand side there, and you see people are being awarded well into their 80s. And if we look at these 2 distributions together, I'm showing the averages with the arrows down below. I've changed the physics into a curve as opposed to the bars that we see on there, so we can compare them. And you can see from this that those that are awarded Nobel Prize in chemistry are a little bit older, usually by about 5 years than physics. And physics has a lot of laws, so a lot less complex than even chemistry is. Medicine is one of those things that kind of falls in the middle. Look what happened to the mode. You know, the histogram kind of looks the same, but the mode's now gone up to 62.5. We're dealing with something that's kind of in the middle. Well, medicine, obviously they're great natural scientists. They deal with a lot of things that are a lot shorter term, but they're also starting to deal with some time elements. You know, when a disease starts, is it the same when we initially contract that disease and what happens to us a week later? So we see some of these developments there, and we can see the difference then in the distributions between physics, chemistry, and medicine now in green, so that we see that there's a very slow increase in those distributions. Well, let's look at some of the very complex and on the other side, where we go into literature. And when you win a Nobel Prize in literature, it's usually a novelist or someone that's written a longer story. Here's what's interesting about that. Since I've done these graphs, I've went back and looked at that because they also have a Nobel Prize in poetry. Well, the poetry Nobel laureates are a much younger distribution than those that are writing novels. Well, that makes sense. What's a good poem? It's knowing a few rules and having a lot of passion. Well, we all have teenagers and 20-year-olds that we're raising. They might not have passion for petroleum geology like we do, but they've got passion. If you're 20 years old and you're not passionate, something's wrong with you. And so anyway, it's a much younger age distribution. By the time we get to these Nobel laureates in literature, this now is awarding people over a long period of time. It's usually for one particular work, but it's usually something like a novel. Well, not only are you a good writer, and not only have you developed your craft, but unless you have some really interesting life experiences, and you can pull from those life experiences and put those in your novel, you're not a very good writer. So it makes sense, but it's a much more complex science by the time we get to that age. And I don't know if you can tell, but if I put that with the other ones, look at the jump. I mean, there were incremental jumps when we were looking at a lot of various sciences, but they were non-complex sciences, and we've jumped all the way over here to the complex. That's a big jump on the distributions and averages that we see in there. And then finally, this is in economics. Well, pulled another social science, and economics is the same way. Economics is very interesting because people that are good engineers can make good economists, but there are 2 very different sides. Engineering is non-complex. Economics is complex. Well, it's not just crunching the numbers in economics that makes a good economist. It's also, what else are they looking at that engineers typically aren't looking at as much? They're, again, looking at time frames. How's the economy changed over a 1, 2 to 5 to 10 year period of time? Where is it going? It makes it a much more complex science. And if we tell by these Nobel laureates, there it is with literature in medicine and chemistry. So you can kind of see that there's a grouping of complex and non-complex sciences with that. Now what I'm going to do in these two is I'm going to take two of the very non-complex and two of the very complex and say, okay, they're probably awarded 10 or 15 years later. So I put a circle where the averages actually are between those, and then the red circle is probably the time period. I did not go back. I'm going to show you some studies that did go back and look at that. But what we're seeing is in these non-complex sciences, the breakthrough creativity is happening in their late 30s and early 40s. And if we look at the more complex, that these breakthroughs are happening in their 50s to their 70s when we look at these creative people. And so that's the distribution that we see going from these. So it seems to hold up these complexity of these sciences. So let's look at now some other factors that have to do it. And this was a study that looked at the age of achievement. So this is when the people came up with their creative idea. How old were they? And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the distribution of contributions before 1935, those between 1935 and 1965, and those after 1965. And we probably could add another one on there now because another 30 years, we probably could put another one on there between 1995 and today, and you can see what's happening over time. It's shifting to the right. Why is that happening? Well, we know more about each one of the sciences. You know, the breakthroughs that Einstein came up with are now being developed by other people. But today, you're not starting where Einstein did when he was 20 years old. You have to know everything that Einstein did and then add to it on top of that. So you have to have more and more knowledge every year than you did before. The doubling of sciences during the time of the American Revolution, which was the Enlightenment that's going on around the world, sciences were doubling in time frames that were centuries, many centuries. By World War II, those time frames were in decades, 10 to 20 years. Science would double. Before we got into the 21st century, those time frames were down to about 5 years. And they're probably less today than that. So that means that if you're not keeping yourself educated and you're not staying on top of it, you don't have all the knowledge that the people before you had, and it gets tougher and tougher all the time to be able to do that. Now here's James Garvin, and what he's showing is that on the y-axis he's showing content and he's showing on the x-axis understanding. So we start with data and information. And then we finally get to knowledge and we finally get to wisdom. So these are looking at different variables than what Bloom's taxonomy does, but he's saying that as the context increases and we have a very great degree of understanding, well, where does that take us? That takes us all the way out to wisdom. Well, can you start at wisdom? No, you can't. You have to have the experiences, number one, and everybody gets experiences. You know, babies in the womb are having experiences. All young children are having experiences. People in their 80s, 90s are having experiences. So experiences covers that entire range of data and information. Number two, I put on there, I went back down to understanding because if you're just looking at data, it doesn't show that you have an understanding yet. You have to have some information to go along with that, and you start asking those questions: who, what, when, where. Well, when my children were old enough to start being able to ask, can I go over to Susie's house? Can I go play baseball down the street? My wife and I said, who are you going to be with? Where are you going to be? When are you going? When are you going to be back? And where is it going to occur? Well, what was I trying to teach them? I was trying to get them into these thinking domains, and I wanted them to think, no, I'm not just running down the street to play baseball. I know I'm going to have to answer these questions because my parents ask me every time what these questions are. I was trying to get them beyond just data and just the initial emotion of what they wanted to do and get into these thinking domains. Because what I wanted to develop is get them to number 3, right? I hope I can develop common sense in my children at an early enough age that common sense, that they find some use in that common sense. And finally, we get to the point of of insight. A lot of people will never get there, but we want to be able to get to that point of having wisdom and be able to answer those questions. I meant to take a picture of what I have on our garage door as they go out. Because after they've said, they've had to answer these questions for their parents of who, what, when, where, the last thing they see as they go out the back door is return with honor. That was more important for them as teenagers than it probably was at baseball age. All right, so what age is the peak of creativity? Well, it depends on what science we're looking at. A study of 90 Nobel laureates, and this is not mine, this was one that just was published in 2018. So they looked at 90 Nobel laureates in very specific areas. They looked at the 100 most popular classical composers, and which are lifetime creators, and we're going to get into that in a second. And we looked at 221 paint artists. I wanted to just not put the general term artists on there, and those are lifetime creators. Well, what's the difference? Are you creative over a long period of time, or did you have one brilliant idea and you rode that for your entire career? So we'll look at that in just a minute. So what was the specific age? What was the Super Bowl timing that we talked about? The middle of the third quarter is 62.5% of the way through the game. Look at this. So I put it down not as an age, but of their entire lifespan. Because people are living longer and longer, but you have to have more and more information. So if your average life expectancy is 40 years old, you better come up with your creative ideas before you're 40 years old. If you can live to 90 and take a percentage of your time, 60% of 90 or something a little bit above that is the age of 54. Well, as we become older and older, people are living longer periods of time. We're going to see creativity has nothing to do with the age of the brain. But what that shows is life experience, work experience, and perspective are valuable tools. After all, so I've combined two people's thoughts. Actually, that article by Betsy down at the bottom was a summary of Francis's work that I quoted up above. All right, does creativity decline with age? When do we think that people are most creative? Well, we think maybe younger people are more creative. Well, it's not the case. What we find out is that really the output starts to increase. Now, you're creative when you're younger, but your output starts to increase in your mid-20s. It peaks in your 30s or 40s. Now, that's a very general statement. I'll correct that in a minute. But that people in their mid-80s still have half the creativity they had at their peak. It's pretty amazing that they're able to do that. And then it depends on the discipline as we look. I've added in the words non-complex sciences and complex sciences. The rest of that comes from the dean's work down there at the bottom in this article. And as we talked about, there's a difference between lifetime creativity and peak or specific creativity. And that this creativity, what they found is the stage of where you are in your career or your event is more important than your age. So if you change what you're doing, you've entered a new stage. So if you enter a new stage when you're 60 years old, but you've taken all these other lifetime experiences with you, when you get into that new area, you're going to come up with some creative ideas later in life, which is kind of interesting. So creativity does not decline, and they're not caused by an aging brain. It differs by the domain, what your science is, whether you're a lifetime output or whether you're coming up with a single creative idea at some point in your life. So I've just put this up. This shows mental abilities, and we talk about intelligence, and we say, well, are you creative because you're more intelligent? And what we'll see in a minute is intelligence and other personality traits all enhance creativity, but none of them is necessarily essential for creativity. So intelligent people probably will be a little bit more creative, but it's not essential that you be the most intelligent person in the room. When I looked at this list, and I was thinking about my wife's profession, as I said, it's kind of interesting having a natural scientist and a very social scientist in the same house. And somebody asked her when we were out recently, well, how long have you been in your career? Well, her career didn't start until 5 years after she married me, so I always make sure to add 5 years on to whatever she said, because she's been working on me for over 40 years now. All right, we looked at the definition of what Steve Jobs said of creativity, and here's what I'm saying about creativity. And I'm thinking now about not only the things that we've talked about already, but I constantly add to this and revise it. So if you start reading through that, please. Because this talks about creativity, and who I have in mind specifically are petroleum geologists. And we see that not all people have it. Geologists, just by the nature of what we do, are more creative than the general population. And as we talked about, because you have so many different disciplines that you've got to remember and understand and synthesize together, that by itself is feeding creativity, that synthesis. And so we have an ability to do this more, but again, we'll go back to those percentages of who is really adding incremental differences to your company. And again, I agree with the percentage that we're going up there, that 50 to 70% of us are constantly creative, but it's the top 10 or 20 that are probably coming up with the most creative ideas. So, is creativity, is that a young person's domain? And the answer is no. I wasn't able to prove that hypothesis either, so that hypothesis fails. All right, we already talked about strategic thinking a little bit, but I want to add that in with creativity. Now, strategic thinking can be a little more systematic, perhaps, than creativity. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we manage, do we manage people all the same way? Well, of course not. We have got a lot of different personalities. We have people at different periods of time in their life and their career, so we don't manage them all the same way. The other thing we don't do is we don't manage engineers and mathematicians and the non-complex scientists the same way that we manage creative people in very complex sciences. For example, if your accountant or your engineer, which are non-complex sciences, you walk by their office and they've got nice big windows like this, and their feet are up on the desk and they're looking out the window and they're just staring into the blue sky, would you probably cough loudly so they know you're in the hallway so they get back to work? Well, you probably do, right? Because what they need to do is they need to constantly be working and producing, and they're being the doers. I love Chevron's commercial. Every time I think about this, I think about the Chevron commercial when I think of doers. Engineers are doers. And the Chevron commercial is, we're a company of doers, right? Well, I agree. They're a company of engineers. And those are doers. And I'm not being critical. They are. That's engineers are doers. Now, we go by one of those top 10 to 20% of our petroleum geologists that constantly is finding the best prospects and the company makers. He has the same office. As a matter of fact, he might even be in a corner office. So he's got windows on two sides. And his feet are on his desk, and he's looking out the window into the blue sky. Am I going to cough when I go by that guy's office? Am I going to correct him and ask him to get back to work? He might be creating in his brain the company maker that's the one thing that comes up every 20 years. So I'm going to tiptoe by his office, and I'm going to let him daydream all day long. So there's just different thought processes and the way we work with these. So let's talk about some strategic thinking and some time frames. I'm not going to do this a lot because we just saw a lot of good strategic thinking, but we have different operational and strategic planning time frames. We do this from the time that we're very young, and what we'll see on this chart, if we look at these different boxes now, what we're looking at ages on the x-axis, and we're looking at strategic thinking time plans, and please come to our GCAGS, I keep saying that wrong.
It's a perfect terminology.
It's okay for here?
This
Okay,
crowd.
thank you. See, I'm so aged in advance, I have to stay with the terms I know, right? GCAs, because we're going to go into this in a lot of detail. And not only are we going to talk about planning and where you are on this chart, but we're also going to take, and we hopefully have a lot of young people in that meeting, is we are going to make strategic plans for those people's careers for the next 4 years. But the point being here is most people operate their lives in that operational time frame down at the very bottom. Most people plan for less than a year. More than 90% of the people. Well, if you run a company and your company is drywall and you do that type of construction, what kind of time frames do you need to think in? If you own that company, you probably need to think in a year to 3 years at maximum, but mostly it's a year or less, even if you own the company. Now let's say you're the supervisor on the job and you have 3 houses and you're drywalling 3 houses. What kind of time frames do you need to think in? Well, maybe 2 weeks. That's your operational time frame. What if you're the drywall installer? What's your operational time frame? 1 day or less, right? Knock it out, do it. I had breakfast, I'm making it till dinner time, and that's your operational planning time frame. You know, a lot of, when we started working in South Louisiana, payday would come on the rig floor, you pay them, and the crew doesn't come on Friday, and you don't see the crew on Monday. They just got a paycheck. There's a lot of good fishing and hunting out there. What kind of time frame is that thinking? That's a 2-week thinking time frame. Because by Wednesday, they'll realize they're running out of money, I gotta get back to work. And they'll get back to work, and they're thinking in those kind of time frames. So most people think in those kind of time frames. We hope that people that are congressmen are thinking in what kind of time frames? 2 years time frames. And that's it. That's the way it was developed and thought of. Project supervisors in exploration in a big oil and gas company, they're thinking in 1 to 3 year time frames. So they're thinking in similar time frames to what they are. Now let's talk about senators who get elected every 6 years. Hopefully somebody in the Senate is thinking in 5 to 10 year type of time frames. Hopefully the President of the United States is thinking in 5 to 10 year time frames. Now they're doing a lot of things in the operational time frames, but they're also thinking about those time frames. Who thinks in the longest time frames?
Deepwater.
Judges is good. I never thought of that. That's a very interesting one. The longest time frames that I'm aware of, and by the way, the U.S. Army uses the military uses this, and they're identifying young people who think in longer time frames, and those people are on faster tracks to becoming a captain and a colonel than someone who illustrates they can work on a 1 year time frame. If you work on a 1 year time frame, you're probably on track to be a lieutenant. If you show somebody at 25 years old that you're thinking in 5 year time frames, you're probably on track for colonel type level position. The longest time frames I can think of are coming out of Exxon and Shell and Chevron. The chairman and the presidents of those companies are thinking in 10 to 20 year kind of time frames. They're thinking beyond the net present value calculations that all the engineers are doing. Because what's the net present value of something 10 to 20 years out? Well, 10 years out it's worth a quarter, 20 years out it's worth nothing. But the chairman of Exxon and the chairman of Chevron are already thinking beyond those time frames. So the presidents of the largest corporations are probably thinking in longer time frames than even the president of the United States, president exceptions, time frames might be doing. All right, I put in this chart, there's some of those time frames. As I said, most people will spend most of their life, regardless of age, in that 1 year operational time frame. And I put on there Riverford Resource. I told Bob Shoot this story before we started. When I was 46 years old, I was given the opportunity, unknown to me, by the owner of the company who called me in, who gave me the opportunity to find employment elsewhere. And I was 46 years old. I said, this isn't the way this is supposed to work. But I'd worked for Herbert Hunt and Bruce Hunt, and I worked for Jeff Hildebrand. And I saw what they had done in their corporations. And I worked with them on a daily basis. And so I already had a strategy in mind. I already knew what happened. And so when this person called me in, he said, well, I'd like you to be out this afternoon if you can. I said, well, would you give me 2 weeks? Well, that was on a Friday. By Monday, I formed my corporation in the state of Texas. By the end of the week, I had my strategic plan all written out. And within 6 weeks, I had executed, I purchased my first property. And so by the time Christmas came up that year, I was already off and running. So what I was doing was, I was 46 years old, as you can see at the bottom of the Riverford Resources chart. But what I was planning for was I said, when I'm 61 years old, and I hope I stay in the oil and gas industry and somebody keeps me gainfully employed, at least till that age. But at some point, if I'm not moving up, what's happening to me? I'm moving out. You're moving up or you're moving out? I said, okay, so I planned to 61. And I said, I want my company 15 years from now to be at a point where it more than totally replaces my income that I would ever get if I was the highest paid geologist or engineer. So I had a 15-year time frame to get there. So when we start looking at, let's start looking at entrepreneurship a little bit. I'm going to come back to that one in a little bit. And so is entrepreneurship a young person's game? As we already looked at, some of the greatest entrepreneurs started with extremely creative ideas, and here's what's very interesting. Typically, creative people are not good at running companies. Well, so these guys not only were creative, they started the company and they continued to run it. Now, if you've read Steve Jobs' book, you'll see, after a while, the board recognizes, okay, you've built up this multi-billion-dollar company and you're a really creative guy, but I need more of the engineering mindset at this point. I need somebody that's the doer, that can keep this engine running. You're the creative guy, you're not that guy anymore. But these guys, I give them credit, they not only had extremely creative ideas, they were able to run their organizations. So we look at entrepreneurship, and the subtitle there is actually another one of the articles that is referenced there. Attention millennials. The average age for an entrepreneur is not what you think it is. And the whole point of the article then is, it's much older than you think it is. Now, look at those 2 points. The average age of a new entrepreneur in general is 37 to 40 years old. But they specifically mention oil and gas and other natural sciences, it's closer to almost 10 years older than that. Well, why would that be? It's more complex. Oil and gas is more complex than most people think it is. Most of the people that are not, that don't live in the oil belt, they think it is a very blue-collar industry. They don't recognize that when computers came into the oil and gas business, they were brought in by guys that left IBM, went to work as the finance manager for an oil and gas company. They wanted the computers for all the accounting and all the finance. And that's why computers came in. And what happened? It's about the same time that the breakthroughs were happening in geophysics. Within 6 months, geophysicists were using 90% of the CPU time. But generally we're dealing with we are a very sophisticated industry. Most people don't recognize that outside the people that work in the industry. Geographics, Armitage, he was the third guy to implement Microsoft programs in what he was doing. So it's a very entrepreneurial, and a very creative industry, and a very high-tech industry. So look at the next bullet. The average age of a successful new entrepreneur is 45. So if you look at the distribution, again, there's a shift. What does that mean? That means there's a lot of young people out there forming companies. But the young people that are forming companies are failing at a much greater rate than those that are starting companies at older ages. Okay, so why is that? We'll take a look at that. But it's the ability of somebody who's older, who has more life experiences, who has more professional experiences to run a successful company versus people that are younger that think they have a great idea, but they might not be so great on the company. Well, we've talked a little bit about some of the PE companies, and they're going after the guys that are 35 years old. Should they be doing that? We already saw the average age in the oil and gas industry to start is 45, which means the age of success is actually in the 50s, and the even more successful are probably older than that. Well, why do they go after them? Well, they figure young people are stronger. They can withstand lots of sleep deprivation. They will keep going, and they're more likely to take risk. And then the final point is really critical, and I think Robert was kind of mentioning this on the side. They tie those, it's much easier to tie the future success of a young person, their whole career, and their financial success. Once they get a hold of those young guys, they've got them by the throat, right, Robert? Anything you want to do, they're going to take money, and you go talk to them. Well, how much skin do you want me to have in the game? Oh, not much. They're going to make sure that they have taken enough of your skin in the game that not only, they think that you're gonna work harder for them if you do that. And they wanted to make it so significant that you are gonna make sure not only is your company's financial success tied to it, your career success and your family financial success is tied to that. So that's a big part of it. Now let me talk about some of the other elements, and I really didn't have data to support this. I've gone to the University of Texas, and after 35-year career, it's the first place I've been where I actually have to time in and time out. But I also have to approve everybody that works for me. I've got a lot of young, eager PhDs that want to be the next successful principal investigators in very well-funded research. They want my job, right? That's all right. When I was their age, I wanted my boss's boss job. And so I don't have a problem with doing that. I would work, besides going back and forth to Austin, 55 to 60 hours a week, plus running my own company, which took another 20 hours a week. How long do you think these young, aggressive, eager, bright, talented people work a week?
40, 35 hours, 30 hours.
40? They're required to work 40 hours. I would say 90% of the timesheets I approve are 40 hours. If they've worked a really long week, what's the exception? On the high end,
45.
42 to 43. I mean, so and that's anecdotal, but it just interested me to finally get some of that data information and see what it is. I think our parents thought the same thing about us. They're lazy, they don't work hard, they're not going to be that way. So some of the people working for me now are younger than my children. Of course, we kind of had that same opinion. But I really do think that this millennial group doesn't put, now maybe it's that they haven't found the passion. Here's the great thing about what I love about petroleum geologists. Petroleum geologists as a group of people are typically more passionate about their career and what they're particularly doing on any day than any other group I know. And so I think that's a big part of it. And I think once you find your passion, and someone said, well, you work 40 or 60 hours. I was like, no, not really. Well, you've worked for 40 years. No, not really. I've worked for 2 or 3 years. And I think of work it was really drudgery. I didn't like going in. I couldn't wait till 5 o'clock rolled around. For me, it's mostly a joy. It's my hobby. I love doing it. And if somebody wants to pay me money to do these things that I like doing anyway, that's just gravy. So I really like doing it. So here's what the reality is. Older founders have have completed more complex projects. They have greater vocational skills just from experience, and older workers are more likely to initially self-fund. And I think we saw a little bit of that earlier. Typically what you want to do is self-fund these things. Then, as the PE guys will say, friends and families, and I like what you said, is lawyers, bankers, and Indian chiefs. And that was really good, and I ran a company like that because bankers, lawyers, and Indian chiefs and retired engineers were making so much money in the early 2000 timeframe that telling them about the tax advantages, say, look, I'll give you this kind of return, but besides that, you'll be able to write off 90% of this, and they're just like, they go crazy. And so that was a great way to raise money until when? 2008. And that just fell off the cliff, and it doesn't even exist anymore as a way to get money. But that's typically where you went first, and PEs have tried to move in and take that over from the oil and gas industry. Well, here's older entrepreneurs are more likely to succeed. Look carefully at this chart. This is age on the bottom, and this is the change in likelihood of success by age. And so what this is actually, this is the coefficient that's the increase. So if you look at 50, not only is it a 0.2, and this is versus a 20-year-old, not only is that a 0.2 versus a 0.1 of somebody that's in their 20s to their mid-40s, you also have to then multiply it by age. And so what that means is, look at these numbers. This just blew me away. A 40-year-old founder is 2.1 times more likely to succeed than somebody who's 20. 50 years old, 2.2 times. Almost 3 times more likely than a 25-year-old. And then look at a 60-year-old founder. Generally, we think entrepreneurship is a young person's game. A successful entrepreneur is an older person who's had the experience to be able to do this. So, was my hypothesis correct about entrepreneurs as a young person's game? Obviously, I failed there. So, I've tested 3 things and I failed on each one. Now, have I proven that it's older? No, because that wasn't my hypothesis. I could have taken it that direction, but I didn't want to do it for this study. The last part of what I wanted to get to is what Robert's already talked to us about. Now that I know something about that, and I've increased your creativity, and I've increased your critical thinking skills, and I have a better understanding of where we are in the domains, and not only are we going to be better entrepreneurs as we get older in the oil and gas industry, is that by the very nature of what we do, as far as being domain experts as petroleum geologists, and the complexity of our industry, forces us to have more experience to be more successful. But now, once I have all that knowledge, I have to target it. And that's what we're going to look at as strategies a little bit. And so I found an article that said, okay, and as I mentioned, before I started my company, I wasn't going to start my company until I had a business plan in place. Now, if you go to borrow money, or if you go find investors, they will want to see your business plan. That is not the most important reason to have a business plan. The most important reason to have a business plan is because you have to sit down and think about these things, and then you have to put them to pen and paper, and then you have to make them a reality. A business plan is more important to the chairman or owner that wrote that business plan than it is to anybody else. But these people will want to see it. So then what do you do with it? You stick it in your drawer. But you take it out. Because 6 months later, you've got to revise something. Revise it. And again, who's going to come to your office and see if you've changed it? Nobody. But it's important for you to know what those things are. So I encourage you, if you're an entrepreneur, to write a business plan, whether somebody has asked for it or not. It's going to get you to think about these. What are you trying to do? Thinking about that and telling somebody about that might be difficult. But if you put it down on paper, you've thought it through and you have a good idea. Whom are your targets? If you're a prospect generator and you're doing South Texas projects, before I spend hundreds of hours putting together a prospect, before I start, I want to know who are the companies in South Texas that I'm going to go try and sell this prospect to. And if I can't come up with a good list, maybe I ought to do prospects in West Texas or North Louisiana, if I know some people in North Louisiana that want some prospects. So it's very important to go through these entire processes. We won't take any more time on doing it. I will go back and show the example. Riverford Resources did this. I did this before I spent my first dollar in my company. And then I implemented my plan. This, by the way, these are the operators that I work with. This is the revenue that's come into Riverford Resources from operator, and you can see the highest. And these, what I'm showing are the percentages there. The histograms are actually the dollar revenue amount, which is not shown. The line is actually the percentages of each one of those things. So individually, most of my revenue over this period of time has come from consulting. But the consulting has been the most irregular of the work. Okay? I've got a great consulting gig. There are even gigs that I've had where I have to go out and subcontract with 2-3 other geologists and a petroleum engineer. I'm making a fair amount of revenue by doing that. Well, those are usually, for me, they have been very short. Now, I've had a minor amount of continuous, smaller consulting things that don't add to it. So I look at to the right of that because my production is much more consistent and much more reliable for me. So I've color-coded by plays that I've done in there. The first acquisition that I did within weeks of having an opportunity to leave a very comfortable job was the yellow bars there that are shown by Continental, and you can see that's actually the only one I think I have in 2 colors, which was a mid-continent property shown in yellow. The advantage of that is that, it's shown in red. You can see the second one from the right is another one that's red. The first one led to the second one. And the first one that I bought in 2003 today is producing 85% of what it was when I bought it in 2003, which is exactly what I was doing. But it also led to other opportunities. My plan was to do this very conservatively and was to purchase PDP and purchase PDP that might have upside with it. You can see some of those things do have upside listed with them. It was not to drill and complete to earn an interest. Now you can see the ones that have generated the most revenue have been the drill to earn type of propositions. They didn't come till much later. So if you look at that, so I started in December of 2003, January, I got my first gas production, and within 6 months, and I had an opportunity to get in a program that was multi-basinal, multi-well, very small working interest, in multi-basinal type of play. And look at what happened to my production. My oil production gross jumped way up. My gas production dropped way off. Well, in about 9 months, I realized that wasn't my business plan. I was financially out over my skis. And I had had income during those 9 months from those properties. But somebody came to me and said, would you like to sell that interest? I was like, this is not consistent with my business plan. I'm out over my skis. Somebody sent you from heaven. And I sold it for what I had in it. So I didn't make any money. But look what it did. It got me down to where I wanted to be. In January, in late 2005, I bought my next property, which was that oil property that shows up there. And so for the next 4 years, I had those producing properties. But I wasn't putting more capital in. I wasn't spending anything. I was taking that cash flow. I was building up some reserves because I was looking for the right opportunity. So let me show you what's happened since late 2010 as far as production. So what's over on the left-hand side is what I started out with. You can see what's happened to the green immediately after that. An opportunity provided itself. I had less than 1 second of a creative idea. And look what happened with that creative idea in late 2010. Some people know that story. I don't have enough time to tell it. Buy me a beer later on and I'll tell you the full story. It takes about 10 minutes. But a creative idea which led to that, but because I stayed within my business plan for 4 to 5 years, I was able to do that. And then what's happened since then, I've continued to purchase properties in the right areas, in areas that I knew, that met a very specific criteria. When I'm buying properties, I have a whole matrix. It meets this, 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 this. They all have to be A's. I allow one B. And if it meets those criteria, I look at it. If it doesn't meet those criteria, I'm on to the next one. So when the Oil and Gas Clearinghouse auction books, you all remember those books, people were amazed. They said, well, how can you flip through that in less than 30 minutes and you flip through 100 properties? How can you know if you've come up with properties? Because I had very specific criteria in my strategic plan, and the production had to meet those very specific criteria. And that's and then drilling these additional wells is what's built our gross production up there. So what does this all mean? And so for the employers out there, what does this all mean? When we look at creative thinking and when we look at critical thinking, employers in oil and gas industry during this downturn have made the decision to stay with the doers, the non-complex sciences. They have not decided to stay with the creative people that made the companies in the first place. Well, was that smart? Probably, because prices have stayed low. They've got the doers out there that are cutting their costs down, and they're adding incrementally. So, like we talked about earlier on, linear thinkers, and they're going to add an incremental improvement to get a little more cash. They're going to add an incremental improvement to cut costs just a little bit. That's what they're going to be with. That's how they're going to survive. That will help them survive a downturn. Now, what happens when things get really positive in our industry again? And we've talked about this today. So what's going to happen? They need to go back to those creative people. Well, we'll take a look at a minute and see what has happened to those creative people. So this is the group that they've decided to stay with. And they're not likely to develop these breakthrough technologies. We don't want to look at that. So what's that red circle? That's us. That's creative petroleum geologists. Now where's geology going? Where we're going is the oil industry, the large employers, have decided to stay with the engineering mind focus, with the reservoir characterization, and geologists are part of that. They're a subset of the engineering department. They are steering wells, they're putting together very advanced 3D models of all these unconventional reservoirs. We're doing that at the Bureau of Economics. That's what the research that I do at the Bureau of Economic Geology, or have been involved with. So, it's not that red circle. So where are all those people? And where are these folks that are all these creative people? Well, let's go back to the football game, because that was a lot more fun. Is the creative person that guy? Was it the Atlanta Falcons on that particular day? Well, they were a flash in the pan, weren't they? They played a fantastic first half, and they played a fantastic first half of the third quarter. And then what happened? Somebody with a superior strategy, who's extremely creative, found a way to break their system down and to get his system going. So who are we? We're these guys. We won the Super Bowl championship. We're the older entrepreneurs that have been through this 4 or 5 times. This was the greatest comeback in the history of the Super Bowl. It's one of the greatest comebacks in all of football. But that's who we are. That's who petroleum geologists are. And I hope I've given you some information on the critical thinking, the creative thinking, and the entrepreneurship that supports that philosophy. That is the group of people that are the CIPES members and the DPA members and AAPG that can lead these organizations to where they need to be. The finance guys are looking for 35 and 40-year-olds to do that for them. They're looking for the wrong guys. Oil and gas companies are going to have to come back to us at some point. If oil goes back to $80, and we've said this all along, in the Permian Basin, we have drilled maybe 5 to 10% of the resource wells that will be drilled. There's 10 times at least, if not more, the number of resource wells to be drilled there in the future. So there's a lot of engineering work to do. So if you're Chevron and Shell and Exxon, and you need to grow your company, the only thing you can do is buy the next smaller guy and accumulate an acreage position. So what are you going to do when you need to find the guy that is going to find the next discovery for you that's going to be a company maker? You're going to have to come back to CIPES, and you're going to say to the leadership of CIPES, can you give me a list of 10 names of somebody that can lead our exploration effort to take us to the next level? So what I'd say is, it's all good news. If you like the game, stay in it. I think it's very exciting. This is part of why I wanted to build up a company, because I wanted to get to a point where I got to be 60 years old and I could do my own thing and I could stay in it as long as my wife allows me to stay in it. And I think somebody said before, until they take that pencil out of my hand. And so I hope that's right before they put me in the box, right? Because I think most people that are geologists got into geology for the slides you were showing earlier on. They love geology and they're passionate about what they do. And so this is a great opportunity for us to stay in the game. Thank you all very much.